The terminal at John F. Kennedy International Airport was a swirling mix of movement, suitcases rolling across the polished floors, impatient sighs from travelers checking their phones, and the occasional overhead announcement crackling through the speakers. Amidst the chaos, one man stood out, not because he demanded attention, but because he seemed completely unbothered by it all. Keanu Reeves stood in the first-class line, waiting for his turn to check in. Unlike the other passengers dressed in tailored suits and designer travel wear, he looked casual, almost out of place. A plaid shirt, sleeves rolled up just enough to hint at a life well lived. Worn-out jeans, comfortable, unpretentious. Scuffed boots that had clearly seen more miles than most of the private jets owned by the men standing around him. On his shoulder, he carried an old backpack, the kind that had been through countless journeys filled with memories rather than just belongings. Despite the frenzy of the airport, Keanu stood there in complete peace, as if none of the stress, none of the hurry could touch him. And that's exactly what irritated Richard. Richard was the embodiment of wealthy arrogance, a man who had spent his life believing that status mattered above all else. His tailored navy suit was immaculate, the crisp white pocket square perfectly folded. A gold watch gleamed on his wrist, its price tag easily matching the cost of a small house. As Richard stood in line, checking his email on the latest top-of-the-line smartphone, his gaze flicked to Keanu, and immediately, disdain flickered across his face. What is he doing here? Richard's lip curled slightly. A man dressed like that, in first class? Unacceptable. He had spent his entire career surrounding himself with people who mattered, CEOs, hedge fund managers, luxury brand influencers. This man? He didn't look like he belonged in this part of the airport, let alone in first class. With a smirk, Richard leaned slightly toward Keanu, his voice just loud enough for others in line to hear. "Are you sure you're in the right line, buddy?" he asked, a condescending chuckle escaping his lips. "First class is pretty exclusive. Maybe you're looking for economy?" A few nearby travelers glanced over, curious to see how the casually dressed man would react to the obvious insult. But Keanu? He didn't flinch. Instead, he turned toward Richard with that same calm, easygoing presence, as if he had heard this kind of remark 1,000 times before. With a small, almost amused smile, he simply said, "I think I'll manage." Richard's smirk faltered just a little, and something about Keanu's confidence unnerved him. And yet, he had no idea who he had just tried to belittle. The boarding call for first-class passengers echoed through the terminal, prompting a flurry of movement as travelers gathered their belongings and made their way toward the jet bridge. Keanu Reeves and Richard Coleman moved forward in line, the contrast between them impossible to ignore. Keanu, with his old backpack slung over one shoulder, walked with an easy stride. No rush, no stress, no urgency. Meanwhile, Richard checked his watch every few seconds, tapping his polished loafer impatiently against the floor, exuding the self-importance of a man who believed time owed him something. As they entered the first-class cabin of the sleek Airbus A350, Richard immediately relaxed, soaking in the exclusivity of the experience. Wide, luxurious seats, glasses of champagne being offered, flight attendants addressing passengers by name. Yes, this was where he belonged. But his smug satisfaction lasted exactly 5 seconds, until he saw where Keanu was sitting. Right, next, to him. Richard froze mid-step, his smile vanishing as he glanced at the seat assignment again, praying that he had read it wrong. But there it was. Seat 2A, Richard Coleman. Seat 2B, Keanu Reeves. Richard inhaled sharply, forcing himself to smother his irritation. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath, plastering on a tight smile as he slid into his seat. Keanu, completely unaffected, settled into his seat with the same calm energy that had been driving Richard insane since the airport. No sense of urgency, no need to assert dominance. Just a man who was simply existing comfortably. As the flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering drinks and pre-flight service, Richard leaned slightly toward Keanu, his smirk returning. "Well," he said, forcing a light-hearted chuckle, "looks like we're seatmates for the next few hours." Keanu turned to him, his expression neutral but friendly. "Looks that way." Richard took a sip of his champagne, then tilted his head slightly, his tone shifting into thinly veiled condescension. "So, what do you do?" he asked, his eyes scanning Keanu's casual attire once again. "I mean, first class is usually filled with executives, celebrities, people at the top of their game." Keanu suppressed a small, amused smile. Richard wasn't asking out of genuine curiosity. He was digging. He wanted a reason to justify why Keanu was here, sitting next to him in his world. Keanu could have answered with the truth, that he was one of the most recognizable and respected actors on the planet, that his films had grossed billions worldwide, that he had more wealth than Richard could imagine. Instead, he simply shrugged. "I do a little bit of everything," he said casually. Richard raised an eyebrow, not satisfied with the vague answer. "Oh, must be doing something right to afford this seat," he said with a smirk. "First-class tickets aren't exactly cheap." Keanu just smiled, completely unfazed. Richard took another sip of his champagne, convinced that Keanu was just some lucky nobody who had stumbled into first class. Little did he know, he was in for a very humbling flight. As the Airbus A350 taxied down the runway, the hum of the engines filled the cabin. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the first-class section, ensuring every luxury was attended to. Champagne flutes clinked, leather seats reclined at the push of a button, and the scent of warm towels and expensive cologne lingered in the air. But at seat 2B, Keanu Reeves remained as unassuming as ever, his old backpack neatly tucked away, his hands resting comfortably in his lap. Richard Coleman, seated beside him in 2A, leaned back with a self-satisfied smirk, swirling the last of his champagne in his glass. His curiosity about the mysterious man in plaid had only grown stronger. "So," Richard said, turning toward Keanu with manufactured interest, "you never really answered my question earlier." Keanu glanced at him, one eyebrow slightly raised. Richard continued, his smug tone barely concealed. "What do you do for a living? I mean, first class isn't exactly filled with guys in flannel shirts and old boots. Not exactly. The usual crowd." Keanu, still completely at ease, gave a small nod. "I work in film." Richard blinked, waiting for more. But that was it, just 4 simple words. No elaboration, no name-dropping, like nothing to satisfy Richard's unspoken need to measure Keanu's worth. Richard let out a small chuckle, shaking his head. "Ah, film." He made a show of rubbing his chin. "Let me guess. Cameraman? Grip? Maybe? Set design?" Keanu smiled politely. "Something like that." Richard took another sip of his drink, eyes twinkling with thinly veiled arrogance. "Must have saved up for this ticket, huh?" Keanu just tilted his head slightly, as if he found Richard's assumption amusing. Richard wasn't finished. "Not to be rude," he said, which ironically was always the precursor to something rude, "but first class is usually for, people who've really made it." Keanu simply watched him, waiting. Richard gestured vaguely around the cabin, flashing a practiced smile. Successful entrepreneurs, CEOs, investors, people who actually belong in this space. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice like he was doing Keanu a favor. "See, some people just overreach. They buy a luxury experience when they really shouldn't. You know what I mean?" Keanu didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't bite. Instead, with a quiet, almost philosophical calm, he responded, "I think we all have our place, and sometimes it's exactly where we are." Richard's smirk flickered just a little. For the first time, he wasn't sure if he was winning this conversation. The Airbus A350 soared through the sky, cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet. In the dimmed lighting of the first-class cabin, passengers settled in, some reviewing business reports on their tablets, others reclining with glasses of aged whiskey or expensive wine. The atmosphere was luxurious, effortless, exclusive, exactly the way Richard Coleman liked it. Except for one thing, his seatmate. Despite Richard's relentless prodding, Keanu Reeves remained completely unshaken. Every veiled insult, every condescending remark, every subtle attempt to assert dominance, none of it landed. It was like trying to rattle a mountain, and that infuriated Richard. A flight attendant approached with a polished smile, holding a tray of drinks. Would you gentlemen like something to drink?" she asked politely. Richard barely glanced at the menu before giving a flourish of his hand. "I'll have the Dom Perignon 2008, of course." He shot Keanu a sidelong glance, his smirk practically dripping with self-satisfaction. The flight attendant turned to Keanu, waiting for his order. Keanu's response was simple: "Just water, please." Richard chuckled loudly, leaning back into his seat as if Keanu had just confirmed everything he had assumed about him. "Water?" he repeated, his voice laced with mock amusement. "Come on, we're in first class." "A little." Keanu just smiled. "Sometimes simplicity is enough," Richard scoffed, shaking his head. "Man, what's the point of flying first class if you're going to act like you're in coach?" Keanu didn't argue. He didn't need to. His calm confidence was its own response. But others around them had started to notice. A few seats away, a woman with pearls and an elegant silk scarf shot a disapproving look at Richard. Across the aisle, a businessman with silver hair and an expensive briefcase glanced up from his book, listening quietly. Even the flight attendant, as she handed Keanu his glass of water, raised an eyebrow ever so slightly at Richard's unnecessary arrogance. Richard, however, remained oblivious. To him, this was still his game. A battle of status, a silent competition to prove who truly belonged in first class. What he didn't realize was that he had already lost. Because while Richard clung to wealth as proof of importance, Keanu had something far greater: grace. And everyone could see it. The hum of the Airbus A350's engines filled the first-class cabin as passengers sipped their drinks and settled into the smooth ride. But while the flight itself was calm, the conversation at seat 2A and 2B was anything but. Richard Coleman, still basking in his own self-importance, had spent the last hour attempting to assert his dominance. He had mocked Keanu's simple clothing, his quiet presence, even his choice of water over champagne, but nothing seemed to shake the man. And that infuriated him. Sitting back in his luxuriously wide leather seat, Richard took another slow sip of his champagne before shaking his head in mock disappointment. "You know," he began, his voice carrying just enough to be overheard, "first class isn't just about sitting here. It's about earning your place here." Keanu glanced over, mildly intrigued, but still completely relaxed. "Oh?" Richard smirked, sensing an opportunity. "This isn't luck," he continued, gesturing vaguely at the spacious cabin. "You don't just end up in first class. You have to work for it. Grind, build wealth, make a name for yourself. That's the difference between the people up here and the people back there." He motioned dismissively toward economy class, as if it were another world entirely. Keanu nodded slowly, considering his words. Then, in that same calm, effortless tone, he replied, "Luck or hard work, we all end up in the same place when the flight lands, don't we?" The words lingered in the air, cutting through the cabin's usual first-class arrogance like a blade. A few heads turned. The businessman with the silver briefcase lowered his book. The woman in pearls gave a small, approving nod. Even a flight attendant passing by paused ever so slightly, as if taking in what had just been said. Richard, however, shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. He let out a forced chuckle, waving a dismissive hand. That's just something people say when they don't have anything to show for themselves. Let's be real. People who don't flaunt their wealth are usually just unsuccessful. Keanu took a sip of his water, never breaking eye contact. Then, with a small, knowing smile, he said, "Maybe true success doesn't need to be shouted about, it speaks for itself." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's smirk vanished. The woman in pearls smiled approvingly. The business slight nod, as if confirming the thought to himself. Even the flight attendant, now standing near the galley, tried to hide a smirk. For the first time since the flight began, Richard looked genuinely unsettled. Because deep down, he knew. Keanu wasn't just winning the conversation, he was right. The first-class cabin of the Airbus A350 had changed. The air was no longer filled with just the scent of expensive cologne and aged champagne. It now carried something far heavier: tension. Passengers who had previously been focused on their own luxury experiences were now watching the quiet battle unfolding between Richard Coleman and Keanu Reeves. And for the first time since takeoff, it was clear that Richard was losing. His usual confidence, the arrogance he wore like a designer suit, was crumbling. His every attempt to belittle Keanu had been deflected with nothing but calm, profound responses that had left him looking petty in comparison. And now? Now people were noticing. Richard forced a laugh, though it came out more strained than effortless. His grip on his champagne glass tightened, his jaw clenched. He could feel the eyes on him, watching, judging. He needed to regain control. Before he could speak, Keanu, still completely composed, still as steady as ever, looked at him and said, "The real world is made by people, and how we treat others says more about us than anything else." The words hit the cabin like a final, undeniable truth. The woman in pearls let out a soft of approval. The businessman with the silver briefcase exhaled slowly, as if letting the wisdom settle. Even the flight attendants, who had been trained to remain neutral in all situations, exchanged subtle glances, the kind that said, "This is not going well for Richard." And Richard felt it. For a man used to controlling the narrative, used to being the most important person in the room, the shift in power was unbearable. "Pfft," he scoffed, waving a hand in frustration. "Spare me the philosophical nonsense. You think some wise little sayings make you better than me?" Keanu simply smiled. Richard's face reddened. His fingers tightened around his champagne glass, too tight. Then, in a moment of pure frustration, he shot up from his seat, his elbow knocking over his glass of champagne. The crystal flute tipped, sending golden liquid cascading across the table, spilling onto his own designer suit. Gasps rippled through the cabin. A flight attendant rushed over, already dabbing at the mess with a white cloth. A few nearby passengers exchanged amused glances, while others simply shook their heads in silent disapproval. Richard, now flushed with humiliation, turned back to Keanu, his voice rising with frustration. This is ridiculous. You think you're so damn enlightened, don't you?" he snapped. Keanu, still seated, still completely unfazed, simply looked up at him and said, "You don't have to prove anything to anyone." And with that, the final blow was delivered. Richard froze. Around the cabin, eyes turned away, not because they didn't care, but because they had already chosen their side, and it wasn't his. The tension in the first-class cabin of the Airbus A350 was thick enough to cut with a knife. Richard stood frozen, the remnants of his spilled champagne dripping from the table onto his designer trousers, his frustration now mixed with an uncomfortable silence. The passengers around them had seen enough. Some turned away, unimpressed by his display. Others watched with a kind of satisfied amusement, having enjoyed seeing Richard's arrogance slowly unravel at the hands of a man who had barely raised his voice. And then, Olivia, the flight attendant, appeared. Unlike before, when she had skillfully avoided inserting herself into the conversation, this time she walked straight to Keanu with quiet professionalism. "Mr. Reeves," she said with warmth and respect, offering a polite smile, "just wanted to confirm that your connection in London is all set. Also," she added with a knowing glance, "the captain sends his regards." The name Reeves hung in the air for a moment. Like a shockwave, it rippled through first class. Passengers who had been silently watching suddenly leaned in, whispering to one another. Murmurs spread. Heads turned. Even the businessman with the silver briefcase subtly adjusted his glasses as if to make sure he had heard correctly. Richard? Richard went completely still. His face, already flushed from embarrassment, turned a shade paler as the realization hit him like a freight train. Reeves. Keanu Reeves. Keanu. Freaking Reeves. The same man he had mocked for his casual clothes, the same man he had belittled for ordering water instead of champagne, the same man he had tried to lecture about success, wealth, and status. And now, suddenly, everything made sense. The calm confidence, the unshakable patience, the way the other passengers had instinctively gravitated toward him. Richard's mouth opened and closed, his brain scrambling to process the reality of his situation. I didn't know who you were," he finally stammered, his voice suddenly much quieter than before. Keanu's expression didn't change. Not smug, not triumphant, just steady. And then, in that same measured, thoughtful tone, he simply said, "The truth doesn't change just because you now know my name. It depends on how you choose to treat people." The words hit harder than anything else. Keanu had said the entire flight. Richard had no comeback. because there was nothing left to say. The once arrogant Richard Coleman now sat in silence. His body remained still, but his mind was anything but. Humiliation, regret, reflection. The weight of his own words, his own blind arrogance, settled onto his shoulders like a leaden coat. The whispers in first class had died down. The stares had faded. But the shame? That lingered. Across the aisle, Mr. Whitmore, a dignified older gentleman in a tailored three-piece suit, glanced over. His expression was unreadable at first, but then, with a slow and deliberate motion, he gave a small nod of approval in Keanu's direction. Keanu returned the gesture with an effortless, polite smile. The plane began its gradual descent, the seatbelt sign blinking on as passengers prepared for landing. The journey was almost over, and yet, for Richard, it felt like something far bigger was just beginning. With a deep breath, he gathered what little courage he had left. He turned toward Keanu, his voice no longer laced with arrogance, but something else entirely, humility. "I was wrong," Richard admitted, his voice low but steady. "Not because of who you are, but because of who I was being." For the first time since the flight began, there was no condescension, no smug superiority, just an honest man who had finally seen his own reflection and didn't like what he found. Keanu studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I appreciate that," he said sincerely. "But more than an apology, I hope you learn from this." Richard swallowed, nodding. He would. Keanu leaned back slightly, gazing out the window as the city skyline came into view. And then, in his signature quiet wisdom, he added one last thought. Sometimes what we search for most in the world is what we find least within ourselves. Richard felt those words settle deep in his chest. His whole life he had chased status, used wealth as a measure of his worth. He had looked for validation in power, superiority, control. And yet, sitting next to one of the most famous, successful men in the world, he realized none of it mattered if you had to look down on others to feel important. He had spent the entire flight trying to prove something, and Keanu had spent the entire flight showing that he didn't need to. As the wheels touched down on the runway, Richard remained silent, still processing the lesson he never expected to receive. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something unfamiliar. The desire to be better. As the plane rolled to a stop at the gate, the soft chime of the overhead speaker signaled the end of the journey. Passengers unbuckled their seatbelts, stretching as they reached for their designer carry-ons and expensive briefcases. Richard Coleman remained seated for a moment, lost in thought. For the first time in his life, he wasn't rushing to be the first off the plane. He watched as Keanu Reeves stood, casually slinging his old backpack over one shoulder with the same ease and humility he had carried throughout the entire flight. There was no rush, no sense of self-importance, no expectation of special treatment. As they stepped into the airport terminal, Richard saw something that stopped him in his tracks. Keanu had barely made it 10 feet before he was recognized. A group of fans, airport workers, travelers, even a young boy clutching a worn-out DVD of The Matrix, lit up at the sight of him. But instead of brushing past them, instead of hiding behind an entourage or security, Keanu paused. He smiled. And then, with the same patience, the same warmth, the same effortless humility, he greeted each person as if they mattered. He took pictures, he shook hands, he signed the boy's DVD, crouching slightly to be at his level. He treated everyone, whether a businessman in a suit or a baggage handler in a neon vest, with the same kindness, the same respect. And that's when it truly hit Richard. Greatness wasn't about power, it wasn't about wealth, it was about this. It was about how you treated people, no matter who they were. Keanu wasn't just successful, he was admired. Not because of his fame, not because of his fortune, but because he carried himself with genuine humility. Richard had spent years chasing status, believing that his worth was defined by his money, his possessions, his ability to command attention. But now, he wondered if he had been chasing the wrong thing entirely. As Keanu gave one final smile and disappeared into the crowd, Richard felt something stir inside him, something unfamiliar. Hope. A quiet but undeniable feeling that maybe, just maybe, this was his chance to change, to be better, to stop chasing importance and start earning respect. For the first time in a long time, Richard didn't feel the need to prove anything to anyone. Instead, he felt the desire to become someone worth remembering. As the terminal buzzed with the usual hustle of travelers, Richard Coleman remained still, lost in the weight of what had just unfolded. What began as just another first-class flight, another opportunity to assert status, flaunt wealth, and reinforce his own importance, had become something far more profound. A man he had mocked for being too simple, too unremarkable, too ordinary for first class, had turned out to be someone extraordinary. But the real lesson? It had nothing to do with who Keanu Reeves was. It had everything to do with who Richard had been. And as he stood there, watching the last glimpse of Keanu vanish into the sea of travelers, he realized 5 undeniable truths that would stay with him forever. Never judge people by their appearance. Richard had looked at a man in a plaid shirt and old boots and assumed he didn't belong. But what he failed to understand was that true worth isn't worn, it's lived. Wealth doesn't always come in designer suits, and greatness doesn't need validation. The world is filled with people who defy expectations, and the moment we assume we know someone's value just by looking at them, we expose our own ignorance. True success doesn't need to be displayed, it speaks for itself. Richard had spent his entire career believing status was meant to be flaunted, that the louder you announced your wealth, the more powerful you became. And yet Keanu had done the exact opposite. He never boasted, never proved anything. He never even corrected Richard when he mocked his profession. He simply let his actions speak. And in the end, that spoke louder than anything money could buy. Humility and respect never go out of style. Arrogance fades, power shifts, money comes and goes, but character, that lasts forever. Richard had spent the entire flight trying to belittle a man he didn't understand, and yet Keanu never retaliated, never tried to embarrass him in return. Instead, he responded with grace, wisdom, and patience, and that made all the difference. The way we treat others says more about us than anything we own. Richard had used his wealth as a shield, believing that his success granted him superiority. But in the end, it wasn't the money or the expensive suit that defined him. It was the way he treated others. And when it came down to it, his arrogance had cost him something far greater than status, respect. Sometimes the greatest lessons come from the most unexpected encounters. Richard had boarded that flight believing he knew everything. By the time he landed, he realized he had a lot to learn. The world had given him an unexpected teacher, a man who had nothing to prove, yet had proven everything. And now, as he stood there in that crowded terminal, Richard didn't feel humiliated. He felt grateful, because maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of his story. Maybe this was where change truly began.